If I were trying to reinvigorate or keep alive one of those schools right now, the first thing I would do is lean very heavily into the local and regional community. These are often crucial employers and economic engines in these areas, but too often they don't reach out to the communities around them and say, what do you need from us?
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Office Hours, where we unpack the latest in higher ed trends and what those trends mean for students and families. I'm really excited about today's guest, Dr. Brian Rosenberg, who's the former president of McAllister College. Welcome, Brian.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, I'd love a little information about your background, if you want to share that with the listeners, Brian, to get started.
Sure. Grew up in New York and went to both my undergraduate and my graduate schools in New York State. Never really expected to leave it, but when you become an English professor, you go where the jobs are. So I taught English in college at Allegheny College for 15 years. Then I was a dean, and then I spent 17 years as the president of McAllister. So I divided my career almost in half between being a faculty member and being an administrator.
No, that's great, and I think just gives you a really interesting perspective for the conversation today. I know that higher ed is riddled with so many myths and misconceptions. Is there one specifically that you think that students and parents have that should be debunked?
Well, from a practical perspective, probably the biggest myth is that the sticker price is the real price. The vast majority of private colleges discount heavily, meaning they don't charge what the full price is. And so people tend to look at the sticker price, get scared off, when in reality there are many schools where no one pays that. And the average discount rate is well over 50%, approaching 60%. So it's kind of on sale. So it would be worth, if you're looking at a college, going beyond just the top line price and getting some information about what kind of financial aid is available before you rule it out as a possibility for you.
Yeah, no, I know I had mentioned to you before when I was in admissions at Kenyon, just a small, pricey, liberal arts college. That was always a challenge, making that very, very clear to students. And I think when we look at the data, college is arguably getting more affordable just as those discount rates continue to tick up. I saw in an interview with Inside Higher Ed, you remarked that at the current rate, the discount rate's going to be 100%, but not too
It
just.
goes up every year. It went up again in the most recent data. And as I said, it's approaching now 60% for incoming students. So on the one hand, it's great if you're a consumer. On the other hand, it's not a sustainable financial model for a lot of colleges.
Yeah, that is. I think it's an um, interesting state of things where I think students look at those top line numbers and don't realize that they are in many ways in the driver's seat a little bit as buyers. And I think maybe it was through Strata. It was the only sort of subset of folks who are paying more were very high, very, very high earners at a small handful of specific colleges that are not, they're not eligible for financial aid and are not offering merit scholarships. But for almost everyone else, the price, the research.
Yeah, it's remained pretty, adjusted for inflation, it's remained pretty stable and maybe even dropped a bit depending upon what income bracket you're in. So people who are looking at colleges need to take the next step beyond just the sticker price. It doesn't mean at the end of the day you'll choose an institution, but it's always worth having more information.
Yes, no, Scholarships 360, we completely agree. I think it's a good segue. Something I know you've written about, just this paradox where many philosophically, many in higher ed are very progressive, but the actual industry operates in a conservative way. And I think this does relate to the sort of thinking through on price and financial trajectory of many institutions. And was just curious, in your experiences in higher ed, is there anything that comes to mind that embodies this paradox?
Well, if you look at the way that a curriculum is organized at a college, and you look at 1,000 different colleges, you'll see that they're typically organized in exactly the same way. You have academic departments, you have majors, you have minors, you might have a first year requirement, you might have a capstone requirement. Uh, if there were really innovation going on, you'd think you'd see more variation. So it's just the consistency of the product that is offered. That is something that you don't really tend to see in many other industries where it's exactly the same, no matter where you go. And that is a sign of just how difficult it is to change something that's been around for a long, long time.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about how so many institutions, there's a very mimetic nature where they're emulating schools that, like a Harvard or a Yale, that just have an incredible amount of resources. And in a lot of ways, they're trying to operate like these schools, but they just, they probably should not be operating like these schools.
No, it really goes back to when these places went from being colleges to universities in the 19th century. And this hierarchy was developed where you had the university, the research university at the top, and the college underneath. And so you have all these other colleges and universities trying to emulate those at the top. And as you say, without the resources of a Harvard or a Yale, you can't emulate a Harvard or Yale. I think it's much more important to try to decide what you can do well and do that well, and not to try to be a mini version of a wealthy research university. I wish we saw more schools embracing their own distinctive identity.
Yeah, I also read just as in preparation for this was an article you did for the Chronicle. You talked a little bit about the origins of all of this in Germany, and made me think of the book The Innovative University, which I really enjoyed, by I'm trying Clay Christensen, and I'm trying to remember this co-author. It's slipping my mind. But
It
looking
might
at
have
like
might have been Michael Horn.
yeah, I think you're right. And looking at the one of the exemplars of innovation in the book was BYU Idaho, who you reimagined even the academic calendar. And you've talked a little bit about this too, just how the calendar is quite inefficient in higher education, where there's quite a bit of downtime. Degrees we're taking 4 years, and I know BYU Idaho they challenge some of these traditional conventions, and it seems like it's been a successful experiment, but I guess something that a lot of others I don't think they've created this groundswell for change.
Now, there's a little bit more interest right now in the 3-year degree because of the cost of college. And so you are seeing groups of schools working together, experimenting with a 3-year degree. You're seeing some of the accrediting agencies, which have up until recently required a 4-year degree, say that they're open to a 3-year degree. Some of them are even saying they're open to 90 credits instead of 120 credits. So I think you're going to see more pressure on that calendar uh, than we've seen in the past, because both the financial cost and the opportunity cost, it's 4 years and it's a lot of money. And more people are saying, maybe I don't want to do that. And I think the hope is that if it's 3 years and a little bit less money, more people will in fact go to college.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting to see. I think another interesting tailwind is looking at the dual enrollment space in high schools with different. In Ohio, we had a number of early colleges, and I think that's also quite interesting. Just students, be able to start college with a head start. I know it's at some schools that can be a bit of a challenge accepting some of those credits, but there certainly are opportunities for those students to receive a bachelor's degree in an accelerated time frame at a discounted cost.
Yeah, it really is all being driven by cost. I think if most students had their preference, and if most parents had their preference, they would send their kids away to college for 4 years. But as the cost has gotten higher over time, more people are trying to figure out ways to make it less expensive and faster. And so the dual enrollment is another way. It's becoming very, very popular, and it's is unfortunately also squeezing the enrollment at a lot of colleges. Because instead of coming in for 4 years, students are coming in for, say, two. And that represents a lot of lost revenue for those colleges.
Yeah, I mean, how are you, as someone who's spent a lot of time in higher ed, how do you think about this? I think it is like a reality where, there's we have a lot of colleges, probably not enough students just looking at the demographics. And yeah, I think that you look at the public perception, at all-time lows. Higher ed is not, necessarily in the healthiest place right now. And how do you kind of grapple with the, probably reality that there have been schools who have been, closing their doors or consolidating, with the fact that maybe that is aligned with like a healthier overall ecosystem. How do you think about that being a little bit now removed from your day-to-day as president of McAllister?
Yeah, look, it is a reality. Higher education in the United States, really from about the end of the Second World War through several decades, went through a period of tremendous growth. Lots more colleges, lots more seats, lots more programs. And as long as the demand was keeping up with that growth, it could kind of work. But a few things are creating a perfect storm right now. First of all, as you said, the demographics are terrible for traditional colleges. The number of high school graduates in the U.S. over the next 10 or 15 years is going to drop very, very sharply, 15% or more. And in some parts of the country, like New England, where I am right now, a lot more. And so there are just going to be fewer students. And so schools that are struggling to meet their enrollment targets now are going to struggle even more. And some of them are going to close. The other thing that's happening at the same time is fewer high school graduates are choosing to go to college. It's true in almost every state. The percentage of students who are going to college is dropping. So you combine those two things and you have a market where there is an oversupply. And so schools will close. I don't think it's something to celebrate. I think that a lot of these schools that either have closed or will close have served a real purpose, have changed the lives of many students, and have created communities. Often they're drivers of the local economies in the towns where they're located. A lot of these schools are the largest or close to the largest employer in a small town. So just the way we shouldn't celebrate what happened, say, when manufacturing went away, and a lot of those areas were hollowed out. I don't think it's something to celebrate, but I also don't think it's something that is at this point um, reversible. I think there are just too many colleges, and I think some of them will close, and the ones that are most vulnerable tend to be small, rural, and private, and don't have big endowments, don't have a lot
Mhm.
of resources.
Yeah, no, I think that yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If you were, don't imagine you're looking for another gig as a president at a small rural liberal arts
No,
college,
no.
but how would you think about opportunities to innovate at this time? Do you think it's just going to be everything's going to be too little, too late? Or are there bold things you think institutions can do? And I guess just like a second, just a little bit of context. I think one of the other cool parts of your post McAllister experience has been your involvement with African Leadership University, which is like essentially a startup university in Africa that's, I think, reimagining higher education in a really, really interesting way. So yeah, curious how you might think about innovation if you were.
Yeah, obviously a startup is very different from a school that's been
Mhm.
around for a century or two. It's much harder to change an established institution. If I were trying to reinvigorate or keep alive one of those schools right now, the first thing I would do is lean very heavily into the local and regional community. As I said, these are often crucial employers and economic engines in these areas, but too often they don't reach out to the communities around them and say, "What do you need from us?" Allegheny College, where I taught, is a good example. They've established essentially a satellite campus that is not for traditional undergraduates, but is designed to train employees for the local workforce. It doesn't offer bachelor's degrees, it offers shorter term training. And this was the result of lots of conversations with the employers in, a pretty depressed area in northwestern Pennsylvania. You've seen schools that are establishing partnerships with senior living communities. There are a lot of people out there who are not 18 to 24 years old and who want what a college can offer. It may not be a degree, but they want an intellectual life, they want additional training, they want career advancement. And I think that some of these colleges are going to have to pivot away from the traditional high school graduate market and think about some of those other markets. And it's going to vary depending upon where you're located. So I would look immediately, I would talk immediately to the people in the local community.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think just, to piggyback off of that, where we've, all obviously experienced the rapid, ways technology, AI are transforming the way we do so many things, and you can just, very, very believable that people, even people who have degrees, people who have master's degrees, they will need retraining opportunities, and employers will be looking for ways to deliver those retraining opportunities because they will, I don't think all the jobs are going to be automated away like in the near future, and they will be looking for partners to help them in that,
Yeah,
and
it's very difficult for especially a small or mid-sized employer to provide some of the training that their employees might need in things like quantitative skills or oral skills, written skills, teamwork, creativity. These are the things that colleges are supposed to be good at. And so if you just take those things that you are good at and you have been used to doing with high school graduates and say, you know what, we can do some of those things with people at very different points in their lives. I think there is an opportunity to push back a little bit against that demographic shift and
Mhm.
say, well, if our traditional market's shrinking, we need to look at this other much larger market and be willing to reimagine ourselves, which that's the hard part. Colleges don't find that reimagining very easy.
Yeah, I was talking to someone a few weeks ago. It was, just thinking, we were talking about uh people, adults with some college no degree and they're in their region, and just, there really wasn't a way, or for their enrollment office to even think about that. They were completely designed to be focused on high school graduates and this traditional sort of subset of students. There just was no one. There was no process. Their entire system was just built in this very specific way, and yeah, it was a little bit frustrating just to sort of think how you would get the buy-in to reimagine. And I imagine that would just have to come from the top, from president and trustees, to really, really, really reimagine the way that we were doing this. And you just think about all the different aspects of a traditional institution, and how they are, right now, very most of them are very focused on supporting those traditional high school graduating students.
Yeah, Fred Swaniker, who is the founder of the African Leadership University that you mentioned earlier, has a saying. He probably didn't invent it, but it's that constraint drives innovation. And if you're at one of these schools that is feeling very constrained, it's incumbent upon the leaders to be honest with the community. College presidents always like to put a good face on everything, and I understand that. But if you want people to go along with what is sometimes very disruptive and difficult change, you have to be honest with them. And so too often you see schools that are on the brink of closing say, "Oh, we're fine. We have no problem." And then you read a month later that they're shutting down. And so you need to be honest with your community, and you need to say, "Look, it's either we adapt or we're not going to be around for very much longer." And if you do that in the right way, you can get you're never going to get universal buy-in. It's just not the nature of change. But you could get some buy-in. You know, Technology now allows these colleges to reach audiences that they would not have been able to reach even 15 years ago. We learned that we should have learned a lot during the pandemic about what can be done online. I don't think it has to be terrible. It's clearly different from sitting in a classroom with other
Mhm.
human beings, but a lot of these people who are working, they don't have the opportunity to come to campus and show up for classes at 9 o'clock 4 or 5 days a week. They need opportunities to take classes after work or when their kids are not at home and they can't just get themselves to a college campus. And so I think technology should be making that a lot easier now for a lot of schools.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you mentioning that. I think sometimes the conversations are, very very focused on all the the demographics, a lot of the perceptions, and a lot of the negatives. And there are a lot of there's other industries that are being completely like transformed and changed, and I think in difficult ways by technology, but they're in being done so in a way to perpetuate the company or the entity, so it will live to fight another day. I'm curious to flip this around from the student perspective. If you're a student or parent who's I think it's a valid concern right now just to be thinking 5, 10, 15 years down the line, like, would the school exist? Like, will I have like an active alumni network? Asking some of those questions. I'm curious how you might advise students, like students and parents, to think about that.
I think it is a fair question and a more important question maybe than it used to be. Because as I said, most schools will tell you everything is fine. But worst case scenario, a school actually closes while you're there, but it isn't much better, as you say, if it closes 5 years after you leave and you don't have all the resources that your alma mater can provide for you. So there are sources out there that you can look at that will give you information about the finances of a school. Some of them are better than others. Forbes magazine does a financial analysis. The federal government does financial analysis. There are a whole group of websites that do financial analysis. You could pretty quickly just do a Google search of the school you're looking at and find out what a kind of independent analysis of their finances says. And it's probably not information that the school is going to give you.
Hmm.
So, I think unless you're looking at if you're look, if you're looking at an elite college, you don't have to do that work. You don't have to do it for Harvard. You don't have to do it for Wesleyan. I mean, those schools are very highly selective, very well resourced. They're going to be around, but they're the exception.
Hmm.
And so if you're looking at a school that is maybe not so selective and not so wealthy, it is worth doing a little homework to get a sense of what financial position they're in, because it's a more relevant question now than it used to be.
Yeah, no, and I think for we've seen, I think it was University of the Arts in Philadelphia. There were students who they went there because their previous college closed, and then they closed, so they were impacted by two institutions closing. And the data also suggests that it's disproportionately impacts students from first generation low income students. So yeah, definitely just been I think it's something worth thinking about, with the exception of the most elite of schools. um I know that you said presidents make trying to put on a good face, and I get part of that is you're the public face representative of the institution. Um, a so things are want to project positivity. I think a lot of schools also want to project innovation. And I'm curious, as a student or parent, how you might assess whether students are genuinely innovating um in their work, and what they might be looking out for.
It's as you say, every school uses the same words, and for a long time it was something like we're global. And now that's not quite as much in fashion as it used to be. But right now it's words like entrepreneurial and innovative. I would look at, you know, a couple of questions that I would ask, and this is relevant to what I said earlier. One is, how do you connect with the community around you? What kind of experiential learning opportunities do you provide for students? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that learning through doing is more effective than learning through listening. And so if you're really interested in innovating, you're probably trying to create experiential opportunities for your students, whether it's through internships or mentors or a whole variety of things. So see if the school is doing that or if they're just cocooned within their campus. And if they're just cocooned within their campus and they claim to be innovating, to me, that would be a little bit of a red flag. I would also look at the curriculum and say, does this look exactly like the curriculum at 5 other schools I've looked at? And if the answer is yes, then it may be good, it may be bad, but it's not innovative.
Mhm.
So, a good question to ask is, what programs do you have that very few other schools have?
Mhm.
And if the answer is, well, we don't know, then again, they're not innovating. I'll give you an example from McAllister. The faculty, while I was there, created a number of what I thought were very innovative programs, and one of them was in food, agriculture, and society. And another one was in human rights and humanitarianism. And I would bet that you will find those programs at very, very few liberal arts colleges. And so, if someone asked me that question, I would point to those programs. And so that's a good question to ask if a school claims to be innovative. That is, show me the evidence. Where and how are you innovating? And simply saying something like, well, we're integrating AI into our teaching, that's not innovation. That's what everybody is doing and struggling to do to keep up with what's going on with AI.
I'm curious your take on the infusion of AI in all of higher education. I think a lot of the way it's like discussed is also just very, 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 very surface level. Do you think like at this point is this more like hype? Is there something to it? Is it kind of like it depends on the application and the situation?
Full disclosure, I'm very worried about AI, not just in terms of higher education, but in terms of what it is doing and has the potential to do to our society. We're much better at developing technologies than in thinking through the ethical implications of the technologies we develop. So I'm worried. That said, it is inevitable. I mean, it's here. And it is affecting the way students do their work on a broad scale. When I taught, my typical assignments when I taught English were, here's write a paper on David Copperfield and turn it in on this day. And we all know right now that students could go to AI and have it spit out a decent 8-page paper on David Copperfield if you asked it to. And, that is a temptation that many students find hard to resist.
Hmm.
And so if you're doing something like that, what are you really measuring and what is the student really learning? And so I don't think we've really, as an industry, higher education, figured out how to adjust to that. Clearly, we need to teach in a different way. We need to assess in a different way. In the field of admissions, I wonder whether the standard admissions application essay has any meaning anymore.
Hmm.
When every student could use AI to generate an application essay. And so, if I were in admissions, I would say, well, we need to rethink the utility of something like that essay because we don't know who wrote it. We don't know
Yeah.
if a person wrote it. So, I think up until now, higher education has been mostly focused on catching cheating. And that's not thinking through how it can be used in education. So we're not going to be able to get rid of it. And so we have to figure out how to live with it and do the best job that we can, teaching students how to do the things that we're supposed to do. The one thing that gives me a little hope is that, as AI starts to do a lot of things that human beings used to do, it will be more important to teach students those skills that AI can't do. That is really human skills. Things like teamwork and creativity and empathy. And so it might actually direct more attention back to the liberal arts. I've read a couple of articles lately that said that all of a sudden philosophy majors are in demand. because all these companies that are using AI want someone who understands what the ethical implications of this might be. So who would have thought a decade ago that computer science majors couldn't find jobs and philosophy majors were being hired by tech companies? So it might actually redirect some of higher education away from the purely vocational and back towards something that is more like what we think of as a broad liberal arts education.
Yeah, that's really an interesting take, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Just that was you the learning to code and the rise of like coding boot camps, and that has all evaporated, and is a very challenging um, job market. But yeah, being able to think independently and think about change over time and work with others and think critically, those are I think sadly will become or are becoming right now more rare just as students are it just seems like common sense they're outsourcing some of their thinking to these LLM models. We certainly have seen that with as part of some of our work. We manage scholarship programs for different organizations, and from one of them, we did a little research with a an AI detection tool, and it was like over 30% of them were completely written with AI. And just as my putting my admissions officer cap on. The essays are just completely devoid of any personality, any
Right.
humanity. They were just using all of the same platitudes, and it was a little bit sad because I think it also for these students it removes intention as part of the process, and I have concerns that as we colleges are responding to these demographic challenges of just making things so easy. This, I guess, like a little bit unrelated, but just making everything so easy for students to apply and to get in that you're removing the intention and the thought behind like why are you doing this and spending 4 years ideally on a campus learning something, being among peers. That makes me a little bit sad where if it's just like kind of a box to check, I guess that can be accomplished by students, but you're removing a lot of the intention. I think some of the friction is probably a positive.
Yeah, and I think the students themselves are ambivalent about it. You're seeing, I think you're beginning to see some pushback from students against AI. Part of that obviously is the job market and the fear of job loss. But but even students who use AI don't always feel great about it. It's there. You feel this sense of competition. Well, my roommate's using it, and so he did his paper in 5 minutes. Am I going to devote 5 days to writing the same paper? But it doesn't necessarily make you feel good.
Hmm.
And on some level, I think you realize that you're not getting out of your educational experience what you might be getting. And there's a fear that sooner or later it's going to catch up with you.
Hmm.
If you go to college and you don't learn how to read carefully, and you don't learn how to write, and you don't learn how to speak in front of a group, there's a pretty good chance that sooner or later that's going to come back to bite you. So it may get you through college, but you're not developing life skills that are going to be really, really important, regardless of what your job is, because we don't know what the jobs are going to be in 20 years, but we do know that certain skills are going to still be required.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. I can't help but feel for students who are, in high school, college, grade school right now, just because I think there's, just it's so new. And I think the systems are were not necessarily ready to provide guidance and guardrails and even parents thinking about this. I think it is a very a tough situation where we my wife and I have a 16-month-old, and just my like take is trying to keep her off as many keep her away from devices and technology
Right.
as long as we can. But I do feel for students right now who don't necessarily have the guidance to sort of like deal with this like really really transformative impactful technology, but impactful in the you know always good, bad.
Yeah. No, it's tough time to be a young person right now.
So as we begin to wrap up, wanna end on. I know there's a lot of yeah, there are a lot of challenges, a lot of concerns that we've talked about, but I'm curious, like, what gives you hope right now about higher ed, and as things are changing so quickly. It's June 2026. What would is the second part of that is what would you see in the ideal future of higher education in America?
You know, what gives me hope right now is still when I do some teaching, and it's the students. They, despite all the challenges, they still are interested in making the world a better place. They're still intellectually curious. It's really easy to put down this current generation of students. I don't see it. And so the young people are still there and they still want the same things out of education that young people have always wanted. So, as long as they're around, there's going to be higher education to serve them. What I expect it to look like, I suspect we will, the trend in most industries has been kind of big eat small. My father was a pharmacist who owned literally a corner drugstore, and they're all gone. Now it's all CVS and Walgreens, and they're probably going to be swallowed up by Amazon. And, I suspect what you're going to see is fewer larger institutions. The University of Southern New Hampshire now, I think, has almost 250,000 students. And so, and a lot of these big wealthy universities are expanding, places like Northeastern and Vanderbilt, um, Arizona State. So I worry a little bit that it's going to be sort of a two-tiered system. The people who are wealthy and privileged will continue to go to the Williamses and the Princetons, and everybody else will go to something that is much larger and more impersonal. But I do think you're going to see more big schools and fewer small schools,
Hmm.
just because of the economies of how these schools work, and as I said, because of the audience,
Hmm.
because you're going to see fewer kids who want to go and live on a campus and more working adults who want to get some education, and that's more easily provided online than in person. So um, whether we like it or not, I think that's probably at least part of what the future is going to look like.
Yeah, no, that's there's the consolidation, and I think that makes sense. It's interesting to look in other areas. I've been listening to a very lengthy podcast that it's like a 5 hour podcast on the history of the Rolex watch company. It's interesting, and I know still only like 2 hours in, but towards the end of it, they get to there's a, I guess, as quartz watches became like the new innovation from Japan, and towards the middle part of the century, a lot of the Swiss manufacturers just either they went out of business or had to consolidate and merge, and that's the Swatch Group, which is a big consortium of different watch organizations. Kind of came about from that. So I've just been thinking about that in the context of higher ed, just the kind of these forces right now, all happening at once, and that seems like that will be the kind of inevitable reality. Which, yeah, I don't know. Went to a small private school myself. I worked at Kenyon. It does make me a little bit sad. Just I think a lot of the strength of American higher ed has been in the small private institutions all over the country. Um,
We're the only country in the world that has all those institutions. And I think it is because they are somehow interwoven with our idea of democracy. That in order to have a democracy, you need educated citizens, and not just educated for vocation, but educated in a broader way. It goes back to Thomas Jefferson.
mhm,
And these liberal arts colleges, liberal arts is literally means the art of learning of living in a state of freedom. And so there is something that is very sad about those places going away and us moving toward a focus on more purely vocational training, which is what you find in a lot of other parts of the world.
Yeah, and I think just the, consolidation, where there is something. I think it's a hedge when things are quite decentralized, just as far as the friction of new ideas and innovation coming from, all of those different parts versus just like, very few, monolithic
Well,
institutions. I
we've
think
gotten
like,
used to, yeah, as consumers, we've gotten used to having fewer choices, and
yeah,
it's
yeah,
generally not great,
yeah,
whether it's supermarkets or airlines, they're when there's fewer choices and less competition, um, then these few large entities have a lot more control, and that typically doesn't work out well for consumers.
yep. And I think when you think about AI, it is exactly that where it's a very if there is like more consolidation. I think it's probably a positive that there are different players, different companies like innovating in this space. But if there was just one company, that is very very alarming, just because that is like a very ultimate kind of centralized technology.
Hmm. Yeah, and even there, I think you'll see all of these different players. There'll be consolidation, um, because they're all competing for the same space, and some will be successful and others probably will not. So
Mhm.
I think as time goes on, you'll see probably fewer larger AI companies as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, really, really appreciate the conversation, Brian. This has been really, really interesting, and I think um, a lot to chew on for students and families who are thinking through very big, consequential decisions around education. Just I think you do a great job of like tying that just to the future of the U.S. and the world. So really, really appreciate it. Is there anywhere good where we can point people to find you online as far as social media, writing?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, so you can find my email address on the website there. And I write pretty regularly for the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Education. And now I'm writing more for the Boston Globe as well. So yeah, it's not hard to find. It's not hard to
Great.
find me.
Great. Well, yeah, we'll link to a few of your recent pieces. But yeah, thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. This has been great.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to another episode of Office Hours with Will Geiger. If you're a student or parent, don't forget to check out app.scholarships360.org, where you can sign up for our free scholarship matching platform. For colleges, we've got solutions to make your work easier, which you can check out at connect.scholarships360.org. And one last thing, if you or someone you know would make a great guest on the show, I'd love to hear from you. You can always reach me by email or on LinkedIn. Until next time, thanks again for listening.